What if the greatest mistake of your life was losing the one person who tried to save you? What if power, success, and pride blinded you until love itself walked out the door? In the glittering skyline of Manhattan, Ethan Cole was a man who had everything: money, status, control. But when he fired his loyal assistant, Grace Miller, for daring to challenge his judgment, he thought he was protecting his empire. He never imagined he was destroying the only thing that truly made it worth having. Months later, when his company collapsed and his heart followed, fate brought them together again, not as boss and employee, but as two broken souls learning what redemption really means. Can a man who once led with arrogance learn to love with humility? Can a woman whose trust was shattered ever open her heart again? This isn't a story about business. It's a story about awakening, forgiveness, and the kind of love that rebuilds what pride once destroyed. If you believe in second chances, in love that grows through pain, then please like, share, and subscribe to our channel before we begin this unforgettable journey. The city woke beneath a pale gold sky. From 40 stories up, the glass walls of Cole Industries caught the first light of Manhattan, scattering it like liquid fire across Central Park. Inside that corner office, spacious, silent, meticulously arranged, Ethan Cole stood before the window with a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand. Every morning began the same way. 6 sharp, 1 cup, no sugar, no cream, a ritual that steadied him before the world demanded too much. He was 39, the kind of man magazines photographed against skylines, tall, impeccably dressed, confident to the point of stillness. To investors, Ethan was a genius of precision, the rare executive who could read market data like sheet music. To his employees, he was both legend and mystery. They respected him, feared him a little, admired him a lot, and knew almost nothing about him. Beyond the window, New York hummed awake, sirens, taxis, the faint sound of a street saxophone echoing up from Fifth Avenue. It was a soundtrack Ethan barely heard anymore. Success had insulated him from the noise of ordinary life, leaving him alone inside a kingdom built of glass and numbers. Behind him, the faint click of heels broke the quiet. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," a calm voice said. He didn't turn right away. He didn't have to. He already knew the voice. Grace Miller, his executive secretary, though, the title barely captured what she was to him and to the company. She had worked beside him for 6 years, managing his calendar, his correspondence, and, when necessary, his temper. If Ethan was the engine, Grace was the quiet rhythm that kept the machine from overheating. He finally glanced back. She stood near the conference table, setting down a stack of briefing folders. Her dark blonde hair was pulled neatly into a twist. Her navy skirt suit was simple but precise. Grace had the kind of composure that made people lower their voices. She spoke softly, but everything she said mattered. "The board call is confirmed for 9, she reminded him. "And I moved your lunch with the legal team to 1:30. There's traffic on Lexington, they'll be late." Ethan nodded. "Thank you." Grace smiled just enough to be polite. Then she hesitated. "You slept here again, didn't you?" He looked at the half-folded blanket on the sofa and almost smiled. There were reports to finish. "Of course," she said quietly, "but even machines need rest." The remark lingered in the air, gentle but pointed. Grace had learned over the years that Ethan never responded well to direct concern. Still, she said it anyway. It was part of her unspoken job to remind him he was human. She moved toward the small kitchenette, poured herself coffee, added just a drop of cream, and stood by the opposite window. For a moment, the two of them watched the same sunrise from different sides of the room, two silhouettes framed in gold light and distance. From the hallway came the rustle of early staff arrivals. Phones began to ring. The workday unfolded like a tide. Yet, for those few minutes, the world felt suspended. Grace broke the silence first. "I finished the proposal summary for Landon Systems," she said. "It's on your desk." He turned sharply. "Already I stayed late," she admitted. "You said you wanted it ready before the weekend." Ethan walked to his desk, opened the folder, and skimmed the top page. You cut their projected earnings by 15%. Yes. Their last quarter numbers looked inflated. His brow tightened. Grace, Landon Systems is our largest prospect this year. If we question their numbers before the merger talks, we risk offending them. I understand, she replied, measured but firm. Still, I thought accuracy was more important than flattery. A flicker passed through his expression, something between irritation and reluctant respect. He closed the folder, set it aside. We'll discuss it later. Grace inclined her head. Of course. As she turned to leave, he spoke again, softer. You've been with me a long time. Grace, 6 years. She answered. That's longer than most marriages. She smiled faintly without looking at him. Then, let's hope we avoid the messy parts. He almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he returned his gaze to the skyline, where the sun had now risen fully above the rooftops. The light caught in his reflection a man seemingly in control of everything, yet feeling an unspoken hollow somewhere behind his ribs. Grace noticed it, the quiet tension he carried like an invisible weight. She had seen it grow heavier each year, the way ambition consumed rest, how solitude wrapped around him like a tailored suit. She admired his brilliance, yes, but sometimes she wondered if he remembered why he'd chased success in the first place. As she gathered her notes, she glanced at him once more. He looks like he belongs to the city, she thought, and yet he stands apart from it. A knock interrupted her thoughts. One of the junior analysts poked his head in, flustered. Ms. Miller, the conference team needs your approval on the projection charts. I'll be right there, she said. When the door closed again, she allowed herself a slow breath. She had learned to hide her feelings well. 6 years beside Ethan Cole had taught her restraint, how to be indispensable without being seen, how to care deeply without crossing the lines professionalism demanded. Still, when she left the office, she looked back once. He was standing exactly where she'd found him, coffee untouched, staring at a city that sparkled for everyone but him. Downstairs, the lobby was already alive with people chasing their own versions of success. Grace stepped into the morning air, the chill biting against her skin. Somewhere far above, on the 40th floor, Ethan Cole began another day of conquering the world, and not realizing that the only thing keeping his empire humane was already slipping quietly out the door. The next morning came draped in rain. Thin, silvery lines traced the windows of Cole Industries, turning Manhattan into a watercolor of motion and blur. Inside, the air smelled faintly of espresso and tension. Grace Miller sat at her desk long before sunrise, her screen awash in spreadsheets and financial reports. She had spent the entire night reviewing Landon Systems filings numbers that refused to add up, no matter how many times she checked. At first, she thought she was tired. A missing decimal here, a duplicated entry there, but the deeper she looked, the worse it became. Profits inflated, expenses disguised, stock performance curves smoothed into something too perfect to be true. Grace rubbed her temples. They're gaming the numbers, she whispered. God help us, they're manipulating their stock data. She knew what that meant, a potential fraud buried beneath glossy investor decks and expensive suits. If Cole Industries signed this merger, Ethan's company and reputation would be tied to a ticking bomb. She printed the reports, highlighted anomalies, and stacked the pages neatly in a folder. Then she took a slow breath. You have to tell him. By 8:30, the executive floor buzzed with quiet urgency. The merger signing was only hours away. Caterers were setting up in the main conference room, champagne chilling for the inevitable toast. Ethan's door was closed. He was on a call with board members. Grace knocked softly, then stepped inside when he waved her in. Ethan looked up from a screen filled with projections. Morning. Grace, we're almost there. Today's the big day. Yes, sir, she said, her voice steady but taut. I need 5 minutes before the meeting. It's important. He gestured to a chair. Make it quick. I'm due with Landon's team at 9. Grace sat, folder clutched like armor. I've been reviewing their financials again. There are inconsistencies, major ones. Their revenue statements don't match their SEC filings. It looks like they've been inflating their quarterly earnings for the past 2 years. Ethan's eyebrows lifted. Inflating Grace. These documents have been vetted by 3 separate auditing firms. I know, but I ran a cross-check through their supplier reports. The math doesn't work. Someone's cooking their books. He leaned back, a faint, incredulous smile forming. You think Landon Systems, a Fortune 500 company, has been falsifying data? That's a serious accusation? I wouldn't bring it to you if I wasn't certain, she said. If we go through with this deal, Cole Industries could be legally liable for their fraud. Ethan exhaled sharply, setting his pen down. Grace, we've been negotiating this for 11 months. I've promised the board, the investors, the press. This merger puts us in the top 3 tech firms nationwide. It's the most important deal of my career. I understand that, she replied quietly. But what if it's built on lies? His jaw tightened. You're overreacting. I'm not, she insisted. Look at these documents. She slid the folder across his desk. He didn't open it. Instead, he looked directly at her, his tone cooling. Do you have any idea how many sleepless nights I've spent on this? How much pressure we're under? Everyone's watching. Grace, I can't call this off because of a hunch. It's not a hunch. It's evidence. Evidence that you gathered on your own, he countered, without authorization, without even telling me. Grace's heartbeat thudded in her ears. Would you have listened if I had? A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the patter of rain against glass. Ethan turned toward the window, his reflection fractured in the pane. I appreciate your diligence, but we're moving forward. The contracts are signed. The Landon executives are already on their way. She stood slowly. Ethan, please at least postpone the signing until we verify this. He shook his head. Postponing would signal weakness. Investors would panic. We can't afford hesitation now. Hesitation isn't weakness, she said. Voice trembling but strong. It's wisdom. That was when he snapped. Enough. Grace, this discussion is over. For a heartbeat, she just stared at him, the man she'd defended, believed in, admired more than she ever should have. The weight of his words hit like cold steel. Understood, she said finally, gathering the folder from the table. Then I'll do what I must. He frowned. What's that supposed to mean? But she didn't answer. She turned and walked out, heels echoing down the corridor like quiet gunshots. The conference room gleamed with polished mahogany and pride. Reporters waited in the hallway, ready for photos. Landon's executives, 3 men in matching gray suits, chatted easily near the windows. Ethan entered, mask of confidence restored. Good morning, gentlemen, he greeted, shaking hands. Shall we begin? Grace stood near the presentation table, a stack of final documents in her arms. Her face was calm, unreadable. As the ceremony began, she handed folders to each participant, but the one marked Final Merger Summary was missing. Ethan noticed instantly. Grace, where's the summary packet? She met his gaze, heart pounding. I've removed it from the files. The room froze. You what? Ethan's voice dropped into disbelief. I can't let you sign something that could destroy everything you've built. Landon's CFO looked confused. Is there a problem? No, Ethan said quickly, forcing a strained smile. There's been a mix-up. There's no mix-up, Grace said firmly. I found proof of financial manipulation in your company's filings. Mr. Landon, you've been reporting false growth to inflate your stock value. Gasps, murmurs, cameras clicked. Ethan's expression darkened. Grace, that's enough. She turned to him. You can fire me later, but if you sign this, you'll be complicit. Security, Ethan said quietly. Escort Ms. Miller out. 2 guards moved forward. Grace didn't resist. She set the remaining folders on the table, eyes never leaving his. "I hope one day you'll see this moment for what it really is," she said, "not betrayal protection." Then she walked away, leaving the room in stunned silence. Ethan stood frozen as the door closed behind her. Around him, the once celebratory air dissolved into awkward whispers. Landon's team looked uneasy. The board members exchanged nervous glances. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt something he couldn't quantify: doubt. He looked at the empty chair where Grace had been standing, the folder still resting unopened on the table. Rain continued to slide down the windows, tracing crooked lines over the city he thought he controlled. Somewhere deep inside, beneath layers of pride and pressure, a small voice whispered, "What if she's right?" The rain had stopped by noon, but the air inside Coal Industries felt heavier than ever. The merger signing had collapsed in chaos. The boardroom still smelled of cold coffee and embarrassment. Ethan Cole sat alone behind his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled, anger pressed deep behind a mask of control. Outside his office, the building hummed with uneasy whispers. No one dared to meet his eyes. Everyone had seen what happened that morning. Grace Miller, his right hand for 6 years, interrupting the biggest deal of his career. Now, she was waiting outside his office, summoned by a single sharp email. "My office? Now?" When she stepped inside, the silence was almost unbearable. The late afternoon light filtered through the blinds in thin stripes, cutting across the floor like bars. Ethan didn't look up right away. He kept flipping through the contract pages that no longer mattered. When he finally spoke, his voice was ice. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Grace stood straight, hands clasped in front of her. "Yes. I prevented a mistake. You humiliated me," he said, rising suddenly. "In front of my board, our investors, the press. Do you understand what that means?" "I understand exactly what it means," she replied quietly. "It means no one will accuse you of fraud when Landon Systems collapses." He took a step closer. "You think you're some kind of hero? You destroyed months of negotiation with a stunt based on what, your personal hunch, your intuition." She met his stare without flinching. "On facts, Ethan, on evidence you refuse to see." His hands clenched at his sides. "You went behind my back. You sabotaged a $300 million deal. That's not loyalty. That's betrayal." Grace's heart thudded, but her face remained calm. "Loyalty isn't blind obedience. If it were, you'd be surrounded by yes men and lies." He laughed bitterly. "Well, congratulations. Grace, you've made yourself the center of every rumor in this building. The staff is terrified. The board is furious. And He stopped, voice breaking for the first time. "I trusted you. You still can," she said softly. "If you'd only know." He cut her off. "It's too late. You're done here." The word struck like a gavel. "Final? Absolute." Grace swallowed hard. "You're firing me." "Yes," he said, cold again. "Effective immediately. HR will handle the paperwork. Security will escort you out." She blinked slowly, absorbing the blow. "After everything I've done for this company, after everything I've done for you." Ethan didn't answer. He just turned back toward the window, his reflection a dark shape against the fading skyline. For a long moment, neither spoke. The clock on the wall ticked like a heartbeat. Finally, Grace exhaled, her voice steady even as tears threatened to rise. "One day," she said, "you'll realize that I was trying to protect what you built, not destroy it." He didn't move, didn't look at her. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. When she turned to leave, her legs felt strangely light, as though her body were moving before her heart could catch up. The office outside had gone still. Conversations died mid-sentence. The sound of her heels crossing the marble floor echoed down the hallway. People pretended to work, eyes flicking toward her and away again. No one said a word. At her desk, she pulled out a small cardboard box from the cabinet. Inside went the framed photo of her parents, her mug, the one that said, keep calm, and organize everything. A potted plant she'd kept alive through 6 winters, and the silver pen Ethan had given her on her first work anniversary engraved with her initials. Her hands trembled as she set it gently inside. That pen had once felt like a promise. Now, it felt like a goodbye. She zipped her laptop case, stacked her files neatly, and looked around the office that had been her second home. The view outside the window had always amazed her. New York's endless skyline, restless and alive, but today, even the city looked distant. A security guard appeared beside her, kind-faced but uncomfortable. "Ms. Miller," he said softly. "Mr. Cole asked me to—" "I know," she said, forcing a small smile. "It's okay." She lifted the box, nodded once, and walked toward the elevator. The door slid open with a mechanical sigh. She stepped inside, turned around, and for one last moment looked toward the far end of the hall. Through the glass walls of his office, Ethan Cole stood motionless, staring at his desk. He didn't follow. He didn't look up. The elevator doors closed. Inside the slow descent, Grace finally allowed herself to breathe. Her reflection in the mirrored wall looked calm, but inside she was shaking. She whispered under her breath, "You'll see. Ethan, you'll see soon enough." Each floor number lit up and faded, 39, 38, 37 each one, carrying her further away from the life she had known. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, her tears had dried. Outside, the late afternoon sky had turned the color of pewter. The rain had stopped, but puddles mirrored the city lights in fractured reflections. She walked past the revolving doors, clutching her box close to her chest. The street smelled of wet asphalt and roasted chestnuts from a nearby cart. People hurried past, umbrellas tilted, lives moving on. Grace paused for a moment on the sidewalk, looking up at the towering glass building. 6 years of her life, 6 years of loyalty, laughter, late nights, and quiet admiration. She had protected Ethan Cole more times than he would ever know. And this was how it ended, dismissed like an inconvenience, erased with a few cold words. Yet, beneath the hurt, there was something else, a flicker of peace. Because deep down, she knew she had done the right thing. Grace adjusted her coat, took one last look at the tower, and stepped into the streetlight's glow. The wind tugged at her hair. Somewhere in the distance, a saxophone began to play a slow, lonely melody carried up through the canyons of Manhattan, and above it all, 40 stories high. Ethan Cole stood by the window, watching the rain return in soft, steady lines. He told himself it was just water streaking the glass, but for the first time in a very long while, he wasn't sure. The world moved on, as it always does. Within a week, the chaos of that failed signing was rewritten into a success story. The board held an emergency session, negotiations resumed behind closed doors, and somehow Ethan Cole managed to salvage the deal. By month's end, Cole Industries officially merged with Landon Systems. The headlines were mercilessly bright. Ethan Cole, the visionary who closed the decade's biggest tech merger. From controversy to triumph, the CEO who never flinched. The articles praised his resilience, his precision, his unwavering leadership under pressure. They never mentioned Grace Miller, not once. Ethan read the features mechanically, skimming through paragraphs that painted him as unbreakable. Each word felt like a photograph of someone he used to know. He kept the mask on for the cameras, the interviews, the applause. But every night, when the lights went out and the penthouse grew still, the silence pressed against his chest like a weight. His apartment on the Upper East Side was everything success promised. High ceilings, minimalist art, windows that framed Central Park like a painting. Not a single thing out of place. It was immaculate and unbearable. Ethan dropped his keys on the marble counter and poured himself a drink. Scotch, 2 fingers, no ice. The amber liquid caught the city's reflection as he stood by the glass wall, looking down at the glittering skyline. He told himself he should feel proud. He had done what no one else could. He had turned disaster into triumph, silenced every critic, but the victory felt hollow. There was no one left to tell him the truth. He took a sip and exhaled slowly. The apartment gave no answer, only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant wail of sirens somewhere down on Madison Avenue. He looked toward the desk in the corner, the one where Grace used to sit when she came by with late-night reports. A cup of tea for him, a quiet word of reminder to rest. That space was empty now. Even the air there seemed thinner. At the office, things were different too. Employees avoided eye contact, careful with every word. The new assistant, a young man named Patrick, was efficient enough, prompt, polite, technically perfect, but he lacked something intangible. He followed orders, he didn't question them, and for a man like Ethan, that should have been ideal. But instead, it felt like walking through a room full of echoes. Every morning, Patrick placed Ethan's schedule on the desk. Every evening, the reports arrived neatly aligned, signatures in blue ink, margins sharp. Nothing was ever wrong, but nothing ever felt right. During meetings, Ethan caught himself glancing at the empty seat to his right, the one Grace used to occupy, pen poised, listening carefully before quietly offering insights that no one else dared to voice. Now, the silence filled that space instead. It was cleaner and colder. He told himself she had overstepped, that firing her had been necessary, that it was about authority, not emotion. But some nights, when exhaustion blurred the line between work and thought, her voice would return, soft but unyielding. Hesitation isn't weakness, it's wisdom. He had snapped at her then. Now. Those words circled in his mind like ghosts that refused to fade. Why did her absence echo louder than her presence ever did? Ethan rubbed his temples and tried to focus on the next project. There was always a next project. That was how he survived momentum as medicine. Yet, lately, even success felt fragile. He couldn't shake the memory of her standing in that conference room, eyes steady, refusing to bend. The way she'd said, "One day, you'll realize." He hadn't wanted to realize anything. He'd wanted control. But now control was all he had, and it felt like a cage. On the evening of the merger celebration, the board hosted a lavish party at the Four Seasons Hotel. Ethan arrived in a tailored tuxedo, the picture of composure, crystal chandeliers, jazz band, champagne towers, everything glittered. People surrounded him, shaking hands, congratulating him, brilliant strategy. Ethan, unbelievable recovery after that setback. You never disappoint. He smiled, thanked them, said all the right things. But halfway through the evening, he slipped out to the terrace, seeking air. The city stretched below, endless and alive. He loosened his tie and looked up at the gray clouds drifting above the skyline. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear faint laughter from the ballroom light, hollow, repetitive. He thought of Grace again. Where was she now? Did she find another job? Another company smart enough to listen to her? Was she angry, or worse, had she already forgotten him? He swallowed hard, realizing he didn't know. He had never cared enough to ask about her life outside work. He knew her handwriting, her precision, her schedule, but not her dreams. For a man who prided himself on knowing everything, that realization cut deep. He finished his drink, set the glass on the railing, and went back inside before anyone noticed his absence. Later, at home. He sat in the dark living room, city lights flickering across the polished floor. He opened his laptop, scrolling through news articles, market data, endless distractions. But then, without thinking, he typed her name into the search bar. Grace Miller. Dozens of results appeared: LinkedIn, professional mentions, a few charity events she'd volunteered for. Her profile photo showed her smiling, standing near a community center banner. She looked peaceful. Lighter? He stared at the screen, a quiet ache spreading through him. Maybe she really had moved on. Maybe he was the only one still haunted by something left unsaid. Ethan closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling. For the first time in years, he let the silence be what it was: not the sign of peace, but the sound of loss. The city outside pulsed with life. But up here, it was just him. The man who had everything money could buy and nothing that truly mattered. He whispered into the stillness, almost without meaning to Grace, "I'm sorry." The night didn't answer. It never did. Brooklyn smelled different than Manhattan. Less perfume, more pavement, fewer polished shoes, more sneakers splashing through puddles on cracked sidewalks. For Grace Miller, that difference was everything. After 6 years in a world of glass towers and corporate gloss, the smaller streets of Park Slope felt almost like breathing again. She moved in with her older sister, Clara, who taught art at a local high school. Clara's brownstone was narrow but full of light, its walls cluttered with paintings, books, and the kind of warmth Grace hadn't felt in years. "You don't owe them another thought," Clara told her the night she arrived. "You did the right thing. You protected your principles. That's something to be proud of." Grace smiled faintly, unpacking her modest suitcase. "Principles don't pay rent." Clara chuckled. "Maybe not. But they help you sleep at night." Grace looked out the window. Across the street, a laundromat sign flickered in blue neon. A couple laughed under an umbrella, hurrying home. The city was smaller here, but somehow more alive. Weeks passed quietly. Grace spent her mornings at the neighborhood cafe, laptop open, resumes half-written. A few recruiters called, but none of the offers felt right. Every interview reminded her of conference rooms filled with ego and ambition worlds that demanded silence when she wanted to speak. One afternoon, she caught herself helping a cafe owner understand a supplier contract. The woman, overwhelmed by legal jargon, nearly cried with relief when Grace explained everything in plain English. "You should do this for a living," the woman said. "Consulting. I mean, you actually care." That night, Grace couldn't shake the idea. She pulled out a notepad and began to write independent business ethics and compliance consulting, helping small businesses protect themselves with integrity. She stared at the words until they no longer looked like fantasy. Then she smiled. By the end of the week, a name was born, Miller Consulting. She registered the business online, built a simple website, and printed 50 cards on recycled paper. The tagline read, "Integrity, clarity, courage." The beginning was slow. Her first client was a local bakery that needed help navigating new health compliance laws. The second, a small construction firm worried about misfiled permits. Grace spent hours reading, writing, checking details, making sure her advice was practical and protective. Her office was just the corner of Clara's living room, one desk, one laptop, and a potted plant rescued from her old job. But for the first time in months, Grace felt a quiet kind of power, the kind that came from creating something on her own terms. She didn't have an assistant or a view of Central Park. She didn't need them. She had purpose and peace. Still, there were nights when exhaustion found her, when the city outside was silent and the cursor blinked endlessly on an unfinished report. Those were the moments Ethan's face would rise unbidden in her memory, his steady voice, his impossible expectations, the faint vulnerability he tried to hide beneath arrogance. She would lean back in her chair, close her eyes, and whisper into the quiet, "Let it go. Grace. Let him go." It was easier said than done. She had loved him once, not in the reckless, desperate way of youth, but in the deep, unspoken loyalty of someone who saw what he could be and loved him for it. But love without respect is a wound that never closes, and she had promised herself she would never bleed for someone who didn't listen again. Months moved softly. Spring found its way back to Brooklyn. Cherry blossoms blooming along Eastern Parkway. Families sitting on stoops with coffee cups and laughter. Miller, consulting grew quietly, one referral at a time. Word spread that Grace Miller was fair, precise, and kind. She didn't overcharge. She didn't talk down to clients. She cared about doing things right. A local newspaper wrote a small feature, "Former corporate executive builds ethical consulting firm for small businesses." Grace kept the clipping on her desk, not out of pride, but gratitude. Each new client reminded her that doing good work didn't have to come with applause. Sometimes the reward was a handshake from someone honest, a thank you email at midnight, or a box of cupcakes from the bakery she'd saved from a lawsuit. Her sister teased her, saying, "You look happier now than you ever did in those fancy offices." Grace laughed, "Because I finally get to choose what kind of world I help build." One evening, as she was closing her laptop, she noticed a familiar folder name in her email inbox, Landon Systems SEC Investigation Update. Her heart paused. She clicked it. A financial newsletter reported that Landon Systems was under federal investigation for securities fraud. Their CEO had resigned. Stocks were crashing. She sat back, stunned. It was the very thing she had tried to warn Ethan about. For a long moment, she stared at the article. Then, without realizing it, she whispered, "You see, Ethan, I wasn't wrong," but there was no bitterness in her voice, only sadness. She didn't want him ruined, she wanted him awakened. She closed the laptop and walked to the window. Across the street, the lights of the cafe flickered, warm and human. A small group of musicians played outside, their laughter rising with the night air. Grace wrapped her sweater tighter and smiled faintly. Life wasn't glamorous here. It wasn't easy, but it was real, and real was enough. Later that night, she lit a candle on her desk, her only light. The soft glow fell across her papers and the framed quote her sister had given her, "Do what is right, not what is easy." Grace traced the words with her fingertips. The city murmured beyond the window, a lullaby of subways and rain against brick. She realized, for the first time in a long time, that she wasn't afraid anymore of failure, of loneliness, of being unseen. She had rebuilt her life, not from power or revenge, but from principle, and that kind of strength, she knew, could never be taken away again. 3 months passed. The headlines that once crowned Ethan Cole as Manhattan's golden CEO began to twist, darken, and fracture. At first, it was just whispers, small discrepancies buried in Landon Systems' quarterly reports. An anonymous whistleblower, a few red flags, a quiet audit. But soon, whispers turned into noise. Then came the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Landon Systems under federal investigation for securities, fraud. Partner company, Cole Industries faces scrutiny. Ethan stared at the words, printed in bold black type, while the office around him buzzed in panic. Phones rang nonstop. Lawyers filled conference rooms. The board demanded explanations. And for the first time in his career, Ethan Cole had none. By noon, Cole Industries stock had fallen 15%. By evening, 27%. Investors withdrew millions. Analysts questioned his judgment, his leadership, his future. The empire he had built brick by sleepless brick was cracking from the inside out. Through it all, Ethan stayed outwardly calm. That was his trademark composure, even when the ground shook beneath him. He gave a press statement, his voice steady. Cole Industries remains committed to transparency and accountability. We are cooperating fully with the investigation. The cameras caught the confidence in his posture, the calm in his expression. But no one saw the tremor in his hand when he set the microphone down. That night, he returned to his office long after everyone had gone home. The city outside was cloaked in rain again, a mirror of the day everything began to unravel. He loosened his tie and opened his laptop. The glow of the screen painted his face in cold light, page after page of numbers, transactions, emails, balance sheets, and the deeper he dug, the more the truth revealed itself, like rot beneath polished wood. Grace had been right. Every instinct she had, every warning she tried to give him, it was all there in black and white. He leaned back in his chair, pressing his fingers to his temples. How many times had she tried to speak? How many times had he silenced her? He could still hear his own voice in that conference room. "You're done here." He closed his eyes. the memory slicing through him like broken glass. Around 2 a.m., his chief financial officer, David Cho, knocked gently and stepped inside. Ethan didn't look up. "They're calling an emergency board meeting in the morning," David said. "We've confirmed irregularities in Landon's filings. The SEC wants full access to our joint accounts." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Can we contain it?" David hesitated. "No, the media already has most of it. And Ethan, this isn't just about Landon. The auditors think some of their losses were transferred into our ledgers to keep their numbers clean. On paper, it looks like we were part of it." Ethan's chest felt hollow. "God." David sighed. "I know this isn't your doing, but perception doesn't care about innocence." When the door closed behind him, Ethan sat motionless for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the city, the same city that once adored him, now sharpening its teeth. By morning, the headlines had multiplied. Coal Industries, Faces, SEC probe, investors demand Coal's resignation, the fall of a corporate titan. Cameras swarmed the front of the building. Reporters shouted questions as he arrived. "Mr. Coal, did you know about the fraud? Is it true your former assistant warned you he ignored them?" Walking straight through the marble lobby. But that last question, "your former assistant warned you," followed him like an echo. Inside the elevator, he caught his reflection in the mirrored wall. The suit was perfect, the tie flawless. But his eyes, they looked like someone else's, older, thinner, hollow. He spent the next 48 hours without sleep. Every report he reread confirmed what he already knew. Grace had been right from the start. She had risked everything to stop him, and he had destroyed her for it. At 3 a.m., he sat on the edge of his office sofa, elbows on his knees, staring at the city lights. He whispered, "What have I done?" The words disappeared into the dark. The next day, the boardroom felt colder than ever. The directors sat in a tense semicircle, the air heavy with accusation. Patricia Wong, the lead counsel, slid a stack of papers toward him. "We'll cooperate with the SEC," she said. "But Ethan, we need a narrative of accountability, something the public can trust." "A narrative," he repeated bitterly. "You mean a scapegoat?" Patricia didn't flinch. "If we don't provide one, they'll pick one for us." Ethan looked down at his hands, the same hands that had built everything, the same hands that had fired the one person who could have saved it all. He wanted to fight, to defend himself. But all he could think was, Grace was right. Every word she said was right. He signed the statement Patricia had drafted, authorizing a full investigation, then walked out before anyone could see the defeat in his eyes. That evening, back in his penthouse, Ethan sat at the piano in the corner, an instrument he hadn't touched in years. He pressed a single key. The note lingered, lonely and pure. Music had once been his refuge. His father used to play old jazz records when Ethan was a boy. Every mistake, his father had said, can lead to something beautiful if you learn from it. He pressed another key, then another. A melody formed, soft and uncertain. He thought of Grace again, her quiet strength, her unwavering calm, her parting words. "One day, you'll realize that I was trying to protect what you built." The sound caught in his throat. He stopped playing, hands trembling above the keys. It wasn't just a company he had destroyed. It was trust. It was respect. It was the one person who saw him not as a headline, but as a human being. He sat there for hours, the city alive around him, the piano silent once more. When dawn broke, the sun rose over Manhattan like a cold confession. Ethan stood at the window, eyes red from sleeplessness. He could already hear the world stirring below the investors, the lawyers, the critics. But, for the first time, he didn't think about saving the empire. He thought about saving what was left of himself. And in that silence, beneath all the noise and ruin, one truth pulsed steady as a heartbeat. Grace had been right, and he had been blind. The morning after the board meeting, Manhattan was gray and sleepless, the kind of morning when the air itself seemed to hum with regret. Ethan Cole stood by the window of his office, watching the storm clouds roll across the skyline. The city looked smaller from up here, fragile, almost breakable. For 3 months, he had watched his empire crack. For 3 months, he had pretended composure while quietly falling apart. And now, finally, there was only one thing left to do. He reached for the phone. His hand hovered over the keypad, his heart pounding harder than it should have. He had faced investors, senators, and lawsuits, yet somehow, dialing her number terrified him more than any of it. He typed Miller Consulting into his browser, and there it was, her name at the top of a clean, simple website. Integrity, clarity, courage. He almost laughed. That tagline sounded exactly like her. He found the number and pressed call. The line rang once, twice. Then, a familiar voice, steady, polite, and distant. "This is Miller Consulting. Grace speaking." Ethan froze. He hadn't heard that voice in months, and yet it felt immediate, like the memory of warmth after too long in the cold. He cleared his throat. "Grace. It's Ethan." A pause. The quiet stretched long enough for him to imagine her face, eyes narrowing, posture straightening, emotion tucked neatly behind professionalism. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Cole." The formality in her tone hit harder than anger ever could. "I wasn't sure you'd answer," he said. "I debated it," she replied, "but curiosity got the better of me. What do you need?" "Ethan," he swallowed, staring down at the pen on his desk, the same model he'd once given her. "You were right," he said quietly. Another pause, then a soft exhale. "It's too late for that." He closed his eyes. "I know, I don't expect forgiveness. But Cole Industries is in trouble. The SEC investigation has expanded. Landon's people are gone. The board wants to save what's left. But He stopped, realizing how desperate he sounded. She didn't say anything. He tried again, voice steadier. "I need your help. Grace, no one knows the structure of our operations the way you do. No one understands the ethical side like you. Please." When she finally answered, her voice carried the measured calm of someone who had rebuilt her life from ruins. "Ethan, I don't work for you anymore." "I know," he said. "And I'm not asking as your boss. I'm asking as someone who made the worst mistake of his life." She drew a slow breath, the kind that steadied emotion before it could break through. "What exactly would you need from me?" "An independent review," he said. "Someone credible to separate my company from Landon's mess. You have the expertise, you have the integrity. The public would trust your findings." Grace's tone softened, but only slightly. "So you're not looking for redemption? You're looking for a consultant." "I'm looking for truth," he said, "and maybe a chance to make things right." Another long silence. Ethan could hear faint background noises on her end, the hum of a small office, the scratch of a pen, maybe a window open to the Brooklyn wind. When she spoke again, her professionalism was back, crisp as a blade. "Send me everything you have, financial records, correspondence, anything relevant. I'll review it. If I believe there's a case, I'll take it." Relief washed through him. "Thank you." "Grace, don't thank me yet," she said. "This will be a professional consultation. You'll pay standard rates, and I'll require full independence. No interference, no emotional leverage." He hesitated. "Understood, strictly professional." "Good," she said. "You'll receive a contract by the end of the day." Then, softer, almost as an afterthought, "You've got a lot of damage to repair. Ethan, don't make the mistake of thinking I can fix it for you." The line clicked dead. For a long time, Ethan stood motionless, the silence humming around him. He wanted to replay the conversation, memorize every tone of her voice. But what lingered most was the distance, the gap between who they were and who they had become. Still, she had agreed to help. That meant something. Maybe it wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. He sat at his desk and opened his files. Reports, contracts, statements an empire dissected. For the first time in months, he felt a faint spark of hope, sharp and fragile as glass. Later that evening, Ethan worked late at the office, alone as usual. The rain had started again, tapping softly against the windows. He typed an email to Grace, attaching the first batch of documents. His cursor hovered over the send button for nearly a full minute before he clicked it. Immediately, her out-of-office auto reply appeared, "Thank you for contacting Miller Consulting. Our office hours are 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. All inquiries will be reviewed in order received. Have a thoughtful day." Even her automated messages had grace. He leaned back, smiling faintly at the irony. Across the river, in her small Brooklyn office, Grace saw his email appear. She stared at the subject line, "Request for Review, Coal Industries." Her stomach tightened. She had told herself she was past this, past him, but the moment she saw his name, a wave of old memories swept through her the night she left the tower, the sting of his words, the emptiness that followed. She should delete it. She should say no. Instead, she opened the file, line after line of numbers, familiar letterheads, signatures she recognized. By the time she reached the second page, she knew he wasn't lying. The company was drowning. She leaned back, exhaling. "Damn you! Ethan," she whispered. "You really did it." But beneath the frustration was something else, a flicker of empathy she didn't want to feel. She had rebuilt her life to stand for truth. And if helping him meant protecting innocent employees, she couldn't look away. Grace turned off the desk lamp and packed up her laptop. As she walked to the door, the city lights shimmered on wet pavement, reflections stretching like paths of decision. Somewhere, a church bell tolled midnight. She whispered to the night, half in resignation, half in strength. Strictly professional, but in her heart, she already knew it would never be that simple. The day they met again, New York seemed caught between seasons. A chill wind moved through the streets, brushing against leaves that hadn't decided whether to fall or stay. Inside the glass lobby of Coal Industries, time itself seemed to hesitate. Grace Miller stepped through the revolving doors for the first time in nearly a year. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, sharp and steady. Every step echoed memories she didn't want to relive. The security guard at the front desk looked startled, then smiled faintly. "Ms. Miller, good to see you again. Just a business visit," she said, offering a small nod. Temporary. But as the elevator doors closed, her reflection in the mirrored steel betrayed something else, a quick inhale, the faintest tremor in her hand. "You can do this. Grace, professional, nothing more." Ethan was waiting for her in the executive conference room. He had aged, but not in a way years could measure. The sharp edges of his perfection had softened. His eyes, once cold and calculating, carried something quieter, now humility, perhaps, or simply exhaustion. When she entered, he rose automatically. "Grace," he said, his voice lower than she remembered. "Thank you for coming." She nodded, setting her briefcase on the table. "I'm here because you hired me, not because you asked." A faint smile tugged at his lips. Fair enough. They shook hands, brief, formal, a ghost of the familiarity that used to exist between them. His hand was warm, hers, cool. The moment passed like static. For several seconds, neither spoke. The only sound was the rain beginning to patter against the tall windows. Then Grace opened her folder. "I've reviewed the documents. I believe there's a clear path to separate Coal Industries from Landon Systems liabilities. But it won't be simple." Ethan exhaled. Simple hasn't been an option for a while. She met his eyes, steady and unreadable. "I'll need full access to your internal communications emails, vendor contracts, everything. Total transparency." "Granted," he said immediately. "Whatever you need." Her brow lifted slightly. "You agreeing that quickly feels new?" He gave a small laugh, soft, self-aware. "It's been a season of learning. Grace, I've discovered there's more strength in listening than in being right. She studied him for a moment, uncertain whether to believe it. The man standing before her wasn't the arrogant CEO who had fired her without mercy. He looked human, still powerful, yes, but quieter, like a storm that had spent itself. They spent the afternoon going through evidence together, documents spread across the long table printouts, handwritten notes, financial trails she followed like a detective. Ethan watched her work in silence. She was precise, methodical, occasionally murmuring to herself as she connected numbers and timelines. He had forgotten how graceful she could be in thought, how confidence and calm seemed to radiate from her without effort. When she finally looked up, he was staring. She frowned slightly. Something wrong. He blinked, caught off guard. No. Just realizing how much quieter the office feels when you're not here. Grace gave a half smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Quiet isn't always bad. True, he said, but sometimes it's empty. She looked away, pretending to focus on her papers. Let's stay on task, Mr. Cole. Ethan, he corrected softly. She hesitated, then shook her head. Professional boundaries. Remember? He nodded. Right, of course. As the hours passed, tension slowly gave way to rhythm. They worked side by side, reviewing inconsistencies, drafting statements, tracing the network of fraudulent transactions that Landon had buried beneath layers of shell companies. Each time Grace found something, Ethan listened, truly listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't challenge. He simply took notes and followed her reasoning. At one point, she glanced at him in quiet surprise. You're different. He smiled faintly. I've had a lot of teachers this year. Anyone I know? Just one, he said, meeting her eyes. But she doesn't know she's still teaching me. Grace froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. Then she returned to her files. I assume you mean this as a compliment to my consulting skills? Of course, he said with a small laugh. Strictly professional. The phrase made both of them smile awkwardly, but sincerely. By the time evening settled over the city, the office was nearly empty. Rain streaked the windows in silver threads. The conference table was covered in folders and empty coffee cups. Grace stretched, rubbing the tension from her shoulders. We've made progress. If we can document the timeline of your communication with Landon's CFO, we can prove you weren't aware of their misconduct before the merger. Ethan nodded, leaning back in his chair. I'll get those emails tonight. You still work until midnight? She asked, raising an eyebrow. He shrugged. Force of habit. Maybe that's something else you should unlearn. Her tone was teasing, but her eyes softened when she said it. He smiled. You sound like you used to, and you sound like you finally started listening. He paused, looking down at his hands. I used to believe control meant strength, he said quietly. Now I see it meant fear. I controlled everything because I was afraid to lose anything. Grace tilted her head. And now, he said, I'm learning that letting go is the only way to keep what matters. For a moment, the room felt utterly still. The rain slowed, the city lights shimmered across the glass table between them. Grace gathered her papers and stood. We'll continue tomorrow. I'll send a summary tonight. He rose as well. Thank you, Grace, for giving me a chance to make things right. She hesitated at the door. Don't thank me yet. We're not done. I know, he said softly. But this time, I'll listen. She nodded, just once, and left. Ethan remained standing for a while after she was gone. The sound of the door closing echoed through the quiet office. He looked down at the folders she'd left behind, neatly stacked, color-coded, precise. Everything about her presence left order in its wake. For months, his world had been chaos. But tonight, for the first time, there was clarity. Not because he had regained control, but because he had finally surrendered it. He turned toward the rain-slicked skyline, hands in his pockets, and whispered to the empty room. She came back. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the first step toward redemption, and for Ethan Cole, that was everything. The invitation came in the form of a simple email. Grace, I'd like to meet. Same office as before. If you're willing, no subject line, no signature, just those words. Grace read it twice before closing her laptop. She sat still for a long moment, the hum of her small Brooklyn office blending with the sound of distant traffic. That room, that place, was the last thing she wanted to see again. It was where everything had broken, where trust, loyalty, and something dangerously close to love had shattered under the weight of pride. And yet, curiosity or maybe closure pulled her there. When she arrived at Cole Industries, the security staff didn't even ask for her ID. Word had clearly spread that she was back, this time as the company's independent consultant. Still, her heart pounded as she rode the elevator to the 42nd floor. Each ascending number flashed like a memory. 39, 40, 41, 42. The same floor where she had walked out holding a box of her belongings nearly a year ago. The hallway smelled faintly of cedar polish and new carpet. Familiar and foreign all at once. She hesitated outside his door, took a breath, and knocked softly. "Come in," his voice said. Ethan Cole stood near the window, the same window where he had stood so many mornings, surveying a kingdom that had almost collapsed. But this time, his posture was different, less commanding, more human. He turned as she entered, and for a moment, neither spoke. The room was just as she remembered: mahogany desk, glass shelves, the faint hum of city traffic beyond. But something intangible had shifted. The air didn't feel cold anymore. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. Grace set her bag down on a chair. "You said you wanted to talk." "I did." He gestured toward the seat opposite his. "Please." She hesitated, then sat. He remained standing for a moment, as if unsure how to begin. "I wanted to do this here," he said finally. "In the same place where I made the worst decision of my life." Grace looked around the room. "It hasn't changed much. I have," he said. Their eyes met. There was no arrogance there now, only sincerity, edged with regret. He took a slow breath. "Grace, I owe you an apology, a real one. Not for the company's mistakes, not for the fallout, those are business matters. I need to apologize for something deeper." She waited, silent, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I fired you because I couldn't stand being wrong," he continued, "because I confused pride for strength and control for wisdom. But the truth is," he paused, searching for the right words, "I didn't just fire my assistant that day. I fired the one person who truly saw me." Grace's throat tightened, but she kept her composure. Ethan moved closer, standing on the other side of the desk. "You were right about Landon. You were right about everything. But I didn't want to hear it, because hearing it meant admitting I wasn't invincible. And that terrified me." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "Imagine that a man afraid of being human." She looked down, tracing the edge of a folder on the desk. "Fear isn't weakness. Ethan, it's only dangerous when it drives your choices." He nodded slowly. "You once said hesitation isn't weakness, it's wisdom. I understand that now." For a long moment, neither spoke. The late afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, scattering across the floor in soft amber tones. Dust motes floated between them like suspended moments of the past. Finally, Grace broke the silence. "You said you didn't just want to apologize for the company." "What else?" Then Ethan's gaze softened. "For not seeing who you really were. For looking at you and seeing only efficiency, not empathy. I thought loyalty meant agreement. I was wrong. You were loyal because you cared enough to disagree." She swallowed hard, her voice quiet. "I wasn't fighting you, Ethan. I was fighting for you." The words hung in the air, gentle but powerful. Ethan's breath caught. He closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the weight of it. "And I punished you for it." Grace gave a faint, sad smile. "We both lost that day." He nodded. Yes. And I've spent every day since trying to understand why. He walked to the window, looking out over the city. The sun was dipping low, bathing the skyline in gold. When I built this company, I thought success was about control, about bending everything to my will. But when it all started falling apart, I realized something. Control wasn't strength. It was fear. I was terrified of being seen as weak, so I built walls so high even you couldn't reach me. Grace listened quietly, her expression softening as he spoke. He turned back to her. You once said that doing the right thing isn't easy. I used to think that was just another cliché, but now I see it's the hardest thing in the world. You've learned, she said gently. I'm trying to, he replied, and part of that is saying this. He stopped, his voice thickening. I'm sorry, Grace, for everything, for not listening, for not trusting, for hurting you. The light shifted again, streaking across his face, catching the faint sheen of moisture in his eyes. For a moment, Grace couldn't speak. She had imagined this moment before, in anger and in sorrow, but she had never expected it to feel so real, so human. She rose from her chair, taking a slow breath. Ethan, she said softly, I believe you. He looked at her, startled. But believing you doesn't mean forgetting. She continued, you can't undo what happened. Neither can I. What we can do is make sure it meant something. He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Then let it mean something. They stood in silence, the city glowing behind them. It wasn't the silence of tension this time, but of peace, the kind that exists between two people who finally understand each other. The sun slipped lower, spilling light across the glass walls. The reflection of the city shimmered around them, two figures outlined by forgiveness, not romance. Not yet. Grace gathered her bag and turned toward the door. As she reached for the handle, Ethan's voice stopped her. Grace, he said quietly, thank you for coming back. She looked over her shoulder, her expression unreadable but kind. You're welcome, Ethan, don't waste it. Then she was gone. Ethan stood alone once more, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall. But this time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like the space before a new beginning, fragile, uncertain, but filled with light, change. Grace once believed was something people only spoke about in boardrooms, an idea, not a reality. But over the next several months, she watched Ethan Cole prove her wrong. It started quietly, no press conferences, no self-congratulating announcements, just small things. The first week, he replaced the polished corporate mission statement in the lobby with something handwritten and simple. Integrity is doing the right thing when no one's watching. The staff noticed. So did the board. Then came the meetings. Every Friday morning, Ethan gathered the senior team not to lecture, but to listen. He asked questions. He took notes. He paused before speaking. For the first time in years, people felt like their words mattered. Some employees didn't trust it at first. They whispered that it was just damage control, another CEO's redemption play. But Grace could tell the difference. She had seen him before, cold, untouchable, wrapped in pride. This wasn't that man. This was someone rebuilding, brick by humble brick. In early spring, Ethan launched a new initiative, part corporate responsibility, part personal atonement. Cole Industries would partner with local nonprofits to provide mentorship and funding for small, underrepresented startups. When the proposal reached Grace's desk for review, she smiled. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't strategic spin. It was thoughtful. At the press launch, Ethan stood before a crowd of reporters, sleeves rolled up, voice steady but unpolished. Our company lost its way because I lost mine. He said, we confused ambition with purpose. From now on, our success will be measured not only in profit, but in the good we do. Grace watched from the sidelines, arms folded, expression soft but unreadable. He didn't mention her name. He didn't need to. Every word he spoke carried the echo of lessons she had taught him. Later that day, she stopped by his office with the final report. He was sitting on the edge of his desk, no tie, jacket off, sleeves rolled, less CEO, more man. "You did well," she said simply. He smiled faintly. "That almost sounds like approval." "It's observation," she replied. "Approval takes longer." He chuckled softly. "Fair enough." There was a pause, comfortable this time. Then Grace glanced toward the open blinds, sunlight spilling across the floor. "People notice, you know, the way you talk to them now. It's different." "I hope so," he said. "I used to think leadership meant control. Now I think it means listening." Her eyes met his. "Listening can be harder than control." "I know," he said quietly, "but it feels better. For Grace." Watching Ethan change stirred something complicated inside her. Part admiration, part ache. She wanted to believe people could change, that remorse could turn into wisdom. But part of her still remembered the humiliation of that day, the sound of his voice as he said, "You're done here." Some nights, she replayed their last conversation before the firing. She could still feel the sting. But then she'd see him now, staying late to meet with interns, taking questions from the janitorial staff, volunteering at weekend mentorship sessions, and she'd feel her guard falter. Maybe people really can learn, she thought. Maybe redemption isn't just a story for other people. One Friday evening, after another long week of rebuilding, Ethan asked Grace to stay behind for a debrief. The rest of the office had gone quiet. The golden light of sunset washed the walls in soft amber. He leaned against the conference table. "We've finalized the ethics policy. You've read the drafts." "Yes," she said. "It's strong, transparent. You'll still face pushback from the investors, but it's the right thing to do." He nodded. "Then that's what we'll do." For a moment, they simply stood there, the hum of the city filling the silence. Grace looked at him and saw someone she didn't recognize and yet somehow had always known. Not the ambitious CEO, not the flawless strategist, just a man, stripped of his armor, learning how to lead with compassion. She realized she was proud of him, and that terrified her a little. Ethan, on the other hand, found himself constantly aware of her presence. He respected her boundaries, every conversation strictly professional, but when she spoke, the room stilled. He admired her calm, her intelligence, her quiet fire, and beneath that admiration was guilt, a deep need to prove, not to her, but to himself, that he was no longer the man who hurt her. Sometimes, when he walked through the office late at night, he'd stop outside her temporary workspace, watching the light under the door. She worked tirelessly, papers spread in careful order, headphones in, a faint crease between her brows. He wanted to tell her how much her steadiness meant to him, but he didn't, not yet. He had learned that timing mattered and that some things could only be said when earned. One afternoon, after a long staff meeting, Grace found herself lingering near the rooftop terrace. The air smelled faintly of rain and coffee. Ethan joined her, holding 2 cups. Truce coffee, he offered. She raised an eyebrow but accepted. Truce implies we're at war. He smiled. We were. And now, he said softly. We're building something new. She looked out over the skyline, the city shimmering in spring sunlight. For a moment, she let herself feel the peace of it. The breeze caught her hair, and he wanted to reach out, to tuck a strand behind her ear, but he didn't move. Instead, they stood side by side in silence. Grace spoke first. "You've changed. Ethan, I didn't think you could." He turned to her, expression open. "Neither did I. But maybe people don't change, they remember who they were before they got lost." She considered that, nodding slowly. "Then maybe you just found your way back." He smiled, with a little help. Her eyes softened. "Don't give me credit. I just held up the mirror, and I finally looked," he said. That night, Grace wrote in her journal, a habit she'd started since leaving corporate life. Her handwriting flowed slowly. Thoughtful forgiveness isn't about erasing pain. It's about seeing growth where there was once only damage. Maybe that's what healing looks like, not perfection, but effort. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan sat at his desk, reviewing next week's volunteer schedule. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing headlines or investors. He was chasing purpose. He thought of Grace's words from that afternoon. Maybe you just found your way back. He smiled to himself. Maybe I did. By summer, coal industries had stabilized. The press had turned its attention elsewhere. The scandal was fading into the past, leaving behind something quieter, more human rebirth. Ethan Cole walked through his office one evening as the staff packed up for the weekend. There was laughter again. Real laughter. People no longer stiffened when he entered the room. They stopped to say goodnight, some even smiling. He should have felt peace, but lately, peace felt restless. Every time he passed Grace's office, something in him tightened. It wasn't the guilt anymore. It was something warmer, more dangerous. She had become part of the company's heartbeat again. Though officially she remained a consultant, she attended meetings, challenged him in discussions, and had a way of grounding him with a single raised eyebrow. And every time she spoke, Ethan felt the reminder of what integrity sounded like: steady, calm, fearless. But he also felt something else longing. He hated himself for it. He'd spent months proving that his apology meant more than words, that he could change without expecting anything in return. But now, when he looked at her, the line between redemption and affection blurred. Grace noticed it too. At first, it was subtle the way his voice softened when speaking to her, how his eyes lingered a moment too long after meetings. She told herself she was imagining it, that it was simply professional respect. But sometimes, late at night when she closed her laptop, she'd catch herself thinking about him, not the CEO, but the man who had stood in that office months ago, vulnerable and human, apologizing under the afternoon light. It terrified her. She had rebuilt her world without him. She had learned to find peace in solitude, strength in her own reflection. She didn't want to fall back into the orbit of a man who had once burned her to ashes. And yet, when he smiled now softly, genuinely something inside her shifted. Can I trust him again, she wondered, or am I just lonely? One evening, they stayed late reviewing policy drafts. The office was quiet, the city beyond the windows bathed in the fading glow of sunset. Grace leaned over the table, pointing at a paragraph. This clause still gives upper management too much control over ethical reviews. It needs independent oversight. Ethan frowned slightly. We already have the compliance board. Isn't that enough? It's not about bureaucracy, she replied, her tone sharp. It's about accountability. You taught your team to listen. Ethan, don't start closing your ears now. He set his pen down. That's not what I'm doing. Then what are you doing? She asked, crossing her arms. He met her gaze, trying to protect the company from being torn apart again. By whom, she challenged? Your employees or your pride? The words hit like a strike of lightning. For a moment, neither moved. The air between them thickened, charged. Ethan exhaled slowly. You still think I'm that man, don't you? The one who fired you without listening? The one who thought control was everything? Grace's voice was quiet but firm. I think you're someone still figuring out who you are without control. He looked away, jaw tightening. That's not fair. Neither was what happened to me, she said, her tone breaking slightly. But fairness isn't the point. Ethan, honesty is. He turned back toward her, eyes raw. Then here's honesty. I care about you. Grace, more than I should, more than I have any right to. Her breath caught. Don't. Why not? Because I don't want to be your redemption story, she said, voice trembling. I don't want your guilt dressed up as affection. He stepped closer, his voice low. It's not guilt. Then what is it, real? He said simply. Terrifyingly real. Grace's pulse quickened. She took a step back. You can't know that. You're just grateful I came back. Ethan shook his head. I know gratitude. This isn't that. I've been grateful to hundreds of people. I've only ever missed one. Silence. The city lights blinked to life behind them, tiny constellations of yellow and white. Grace looked at him, eyes shining but uncertain. You hurt me. Ethan, you made me question everything I believed about loyalty, about trust. You can't erase that with kind words. I'm not trying to erase it, he said. I'm trying to build something new over it. Her voice softened, but her guard stayed high. And what if I don't want that? Then I'll accept it, he said quietly. Because the man I used to be would have pushed. The man I'm trying to be will wait. Something in his tone broke through her defenses. It wasn't a plea, it was a promise. Still, the ache in her chest refused to ease. Grace turned away. Looking out the window, the city stretched endlessly, reflections of light trembling across the glass. I thought I'd moved on, she said softly. But standing here now, I don't know if it's trust I'm afraid of or hope. Ethan moved closer, keeping his distance but letting his voice bridge the space between them. Maybe it's both. She closed her eyes for a moment. You really think people can change that much? I don't just think it, he said. I have to believe it. Because if I can't, then every mistake I've made means nothing. She turned to face him. The honesty in his eyes disarmed her. I used to believe control meant strength, he said quietly. Now I see it meant fear. And the only thing I'm afraid of now is losing the chance to show you who I really am. Her voice broke slightly. You already showed me once. I showed you who I was. He said, let me show you who I've become. For a moment, their eyes locked, the space between them alive with all the words they couldn't say. Neither moved, neither breathed. The moment stretched raw, fragile, unspoken. Then Grace stepped back. We need boundaries. Ethan, clear ones. He nodded, his expression unreadable. You're right. I'll finish the reports tonight, she said quickly, gathering her papers. We'll talk Monday. And before he could speak again, she was gone. Ethan remained where she'd left him, her scent jasmine and rain still lingering in the air. He looked at the papers she'd forgotten, her neat handwriting marking the margins. He whispered to the empty room. I wasn't asking for forgiveness. I was asking for a chance. The city lights shimmered through the glass, blurring into gold and silver. And somewhere across the river, Grace sat in her small apartment, staring at the skyline, heart aching, mind spinning, whispering to herself, can I trust him again? Or am I just lonely? The following Monday, Grace didn't come to the office. Her desk sat empty, the blinds half drawn, a faint ring from her coffee mug still on the corner of the table. No email, no call, only a short message sent through her assistant. Effective immediately, Miller Consulting will suspend services with Coal Industries. Thank you for the opportunity. Ethan read it twice, then a third time, though the words didn't change. He felt the quiet land around him like snow, soft, heavy, final. He didn't call her, not that day, not the next. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole had nothing left to manage, no fires to put out, no one to prove himself to, just silence. And in that silence, he met himself. At first, he tried to drown it out. He filled his days with meetings, his nights with reports, but every chart, every spreadsheet, every boardroom smile felt hollow. There was no peace and success anymore, only the echo of what he'd lost twice now. He would catch himself glancing toward the door, half expecting her to appear with a stack of files, her calm voice cutting through his thoughts. But she didn't. And when he realized she wouldn't, something inside him finally broke, not dramatically, not loudly, but quietly, like glass cracking beneath the weight of time. One evening, he found himself standing on the rooftop terrace of the building. The city stretched below him, glowing and endless. He thought of the first day she walked into his office 6 years ago, how her presence had softened the edges of his chaos, how he hadn't understood that balance until she was gone. He whispered into the night, "Grace, I'm sorry. Again." The wind carried the words away, unhearing, unanswering. The next morning, he did something he had avoided for years. He called his sister. "Ethan," she said, surprised. "It's been, what, 3 years? 4, he corrected gently. Too long." They met for lunch at a small diner in Midtown, the same place they'd gone as kids after their father's piano lessons. His sister, Laura, was older by 5 years, all warmth and laughter, 2 things he'd long forgotten how to keep in his life. She looked at him across the table and said, "You look tired." "I am," he admitted. "You've been tired for a decade," she said softly. "But this looks different." He nodded, stirring his coffee absently. "It is." They talked for hours about their childhood, about their father's death, about the years Ethan had spent chasing perfection. For the first time, he didn't defend his choices. He just listened. When he left, Laura hugged him tightly. "Don't disappear again," she whispered. "I won't," he said. And for once, he meant it. He started therapy that same week, not because of the company, not because of the scandal, because of himself. The therapist's office was small, quiet, lined with books. A single plant sat by the window, reaching toward the light. During the first session, the therapist asked, "What brings you here, Mr. Cole?" He thought for a long time before answering. "Loss," he said finally. "The kind that doesn't come from death." The therapist nodded. "Tell me about it." And Ethan did, about his career, his failures, his pride, about the woman who had stood up to him when no one else dared, and how he'd mistaken that courage for defiance. He talked about silence, the kind that feels like punishment, but is really space for reflection. When the session ended, the therapist said something simple. "You're learning how to feel again. That's progress." Ethan walked home that evening under the soft glow of streetlights. He felt lighter, though he couldn't explain why. The months that followed were quieter than any in his life. He began volunteering on weekends with the mentorship program he'd started months earlier, sitting with young entrepreneurs. Not as a CEO, but as a listener. He spent Sunday dinners with Laura and her children, learning the small joys of ordinary life, spilled milk, board games, laughter. Sometimes he still woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding, her name on his lips. But he didn't reach for the phone. He let the feeling pass, like a wave rolling back into the ocean. Grace had made her choice, now. It was time he made his to keep changing, even if no one was watching. Meanwhile, across the river in Brooklyn, Grace was changing too. She poured herself into Miller Consulting, expanding her team, mentoring younger women in business ethics. But late at night, when the city grew still, she sometimes thought of him. She wondered if he was still working too hard, still chasing redemption, and then she'd catch herself and whisper, "Don't romanticize regret." But part of her knew this was different. Ethan had broken through his old shell not for her, but for himself. And though she didn't admit it aloud, that truth gave her comfort. One rainy afternoon, Ethan sat at his desk, watching droplets trace paths down the window pane. The skyline looked softer through the blur, gentler somehow. He thought about Grace, not as the woman he'd hurt, but as the person who'd awakened something in him, something raw and necessary. He whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, Grace, for leaving, for forcing me to see." It wasn't self-pity anymore. It was gratitude. He realized then that love wasn't always about holding on. Sometimes it was about learning in the space that distance created. And in that moment, he didn't feel alone. He felt awake. That night, he wrote a note to himself on a yellow pad, nothing profound, just a reminder. Change doesn't ask for witnesses. It just asks for honesty. He folded the paper and tucked it into his wallet, a small promise, quietly kept. Outside, the city lights flickered against the wet streets, and for the first time in years, Ethan Cole didn't feel trapped in his own reflection. He felt free. 6 months passed. The seasons turned quietly, as they always do. Winter melted into spring, and spring gave way to the warm breath of early summer. In that time, coal industries had not only survived, it had transformed. The company's recovery became the kind of story the media loved, the fallen titan redeemed by humility, ethics, and human leadership. But for Ethan Cole, the headlines no longer mattered. He no longer read every article, no longer chased every number. He had learned to measure success differently now in trust rebuilt, in employees who smiled instead of flinched, in nights when he could finally sleep without the weight of guilt pressing against his chest. He had rebuilt not just his business, but himself. Across the river, Miller. Consulting had blossomed into something remarkable. Grace had expanded her team, partnering with universities and nonprofits to teach small business owners about ethical risk and sustainable growth. Her office, once the corner of her sister's living room, was now a warm, sunlit space in a converted Brooklyn loft. Plants lined the windows. Laughter drifted through the halls. The scent of fresh coffee and paper filled the air. She worked hard, but it no longer came from fear or duty. It came from purpose, from peace. And yet, in quiet moments when she stayed late, when the city hummed outside her window, her thoughts drifted to Ethan. Not with bitterness, not even with longing, just with the quiet curiosity that lingers when two lives have crossed in ways that neither time nor distance can quite erase. She sometimes wondered if he ever thought of her, too. Then she would smile to herself and whisper, "Of course not. Grace, he's moved on." And yet, deep down, she wasn't sure. For Ethan, thoughts of Grace came like the evening light, unexpected, soft, but impossible to ignore. He would be reviewing proposals or speaking to new recruits, and something she'd once said would echo in his mind: loyalty isn't obedience, it's courage. He could still hear her voice, calm and steady. He could still see her eyes the day she walked out of his office the second time, sad, but unbroken. Sometimes he wondered if she had forgiven him. Sometimes he wondered if it even mattered. He had spent so long trying to make peace with her absence that he'd stopped believing he would ever see her again. Until one ordinary afternoon in late June. The conference center was packed. The annual New York Business Ethics Forum drew executives, professors, and journalists from across the country. Ethan had been invited to speak on a panel titled "Rebuilding Corporate Trust." He arrived early, as he always did, nodding politely to organizers and slipping through the crowd with practiced ease. He was calmer now, still composed, but softer around the edges. As he stood near the back of the auditorium, reviewing his notes, he heard a voice from the stage microphone, a familiar voice. "Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Grace Miller, founder of Miller Consulting. Thank you for joining our session on ethical accountability in modern business." Ethan froze. For a moment, the noise of the room vanished. He looked up. There she was, poised behind the podium, confident, graceful, illuminated by the pale gold light of the overhead lamps. Her hair was looser now, falling in soft waves. Her voice was steady, practiced, carrying the clarity of someone who believed in every word she spoke. He hadn't seen her in half a year, and yet, in that instant, it felt like no time had passed at all. Grace didn't notice him at first. She was focused on her presentation statistics, case studies, practical tools for ethical reform. Her passion was effortless, genuine. She wasn't just speaking, she was teaching. Ethan watched from the back row, his chest tight with something that wasn't quite nostalgia and wasn't quite regret. It was awe. He realized he wasn't watching the woman who had once worked for him. He was watching the woman she had always been, the one he had been too blind, too proud to see. When her session ended, applause filled the hall. Grace smiled politely, thanked the audience, and began gathering her papers. That's when she looked up and saw him. Her breath caught. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then she blinked, steadying herself. Ethan lifted a hand slightly, just a small, respectful gesture. He didn't smile, not fully. He simply waited. She hesitated, then nodded once before turning back to her things. But something in her eyes, a flicker, a soft widening, betrayed what her composure hid. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. When he reached the edge of the stage, she turned to face him. "Grace," he said quietly. "Ethan." Her tone was even, but her pulse fluttered visibly at her throat. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said. "I didn't either," she replied. "Though I suppose ethics would draw us both eventually." He smiled gently. "Seems fitting." She gathered her notes into her bag. "You're speaking on the next panel, aren't you?" "Yes," he said, "rebuilding corporate trust." "That's poetic," she said, her lips curving slightly. "Or ironic," he replied, a touch of humor in his voice. For the first time in months, they shared the smallest laugh. It wasn't the laughter of old friends. It was the laughter of two people who had once broken each other and somehow learned to heal anyway. A few minutes later, as attendees shuffled between sessions, they stepped aside near a quiet corner of the lobby. "How have you been?" he asked. The question simple, but weighted. "Good," she said honestly. "Busy, fulfilled, you different," he said after a pause. "But in the best way." She nodded, studying him. "You look different. Older," he teased. "Maybe just lighter," she said softly. He smiled. "That's a first." They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the crowd dimming around them. He wanted to say more, to tell her how proud he was of her, how often her voice still guided his choices, but he didn't. Instead, he simply said, "It's good to see you. Grace." Her expression softened. "You too. Ethan." And with that, she excused herself to prepare for her next session, leaving him standing there, watching her walk away again. But this time, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like timing, like the world had turned just enough for possibility to exist again. As Ethan took his place on the stage for his own panel, he looked toward the back of the room. For a moment, he caught sight of her seated near the exit, listening quietly. He began his talk, steady and calm, but his opening line wasn't in his notes. "The greatest lessons in leadership," he said, "don't come from victory. They come from the people who are brave enough to tell us when we're wrong." His eyes met hers across the room. Grace smiled, small, proud, knowing. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole felt like the story wasn't ending. It was beginning again. The rain began just as the conference ended, soft, steady, the kind that turned New York streets into mirrors of light. Grace stood under the awning outside the event center, adjusting her coat, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Still afraid of rain, she turned, surprised, to see Ethan standing there, an umbrella in one hand, a half smile on his face. "I was never afraid of it," she said. "I just never liked being caught in it unprepared." "Then maybe I can help with that," he said, lifting the umbrella slightly. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the soft hiss of rain filling the silence. Then Grace nodded. "All right, but only if you promise not to talk about quarterly reports." Ethan laughed quietly. "Deal." They walked together down a narrow street in Greenwich Village, the pavement slick with reflections of cafe lights. The city was softer here, quieter, older, wrapped in the smell of rain and roasted coffee beans. Ethan led her to a small restaurant tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop. No reservations, no paparazzi. Just 12 tables and the sound of jazz drifting from a speaker near the bar. The hostess smiled at them knowingly. Two, Ethan said. They sat by the window, condensation blurring the view of passing umbrellas. The waiter brought wine, then left them in the gentle hum of conversation and candlelight. For a while, neither spoke. Grace sipped her wine slowly, watching the rain trail down the glass. Ethan watched her not the way he used to, searching for reassurance, but quietly, gratefully. "Finally," she said, "you've changed your taste in restaurants. You used to only eat where the plates matched the furniture." He smiled. "Maybe I got tired of symmetry." She raised an eyebrow. Or maybe you learned it's okay when life doesn't match. Maybe, he said softly. They talked at first about safe things, the conference, her work, his mentorship program, the strange comfort of normalcy after chaos. But eventually, the conversation deepened, as it always did with them. Grace leaned back in her chair, her voice low and thoughtful. You know what I've realized? Ethan, forgiveness isn't a gift you give someone. It's a freedom you give yourself. He nodded slowly. I used to think forgiveness had to be earned. But maybe it's not about earning, it's about understanding. She looked at him, curious. Understanding what? That sometimes people break others before they realize they're broken themselves. Her eyes softened. That's honest. It's all I know how to be anymore, he said quietly. They fell silent again, not awkwardly, but with a kind of mutual reverence. Outside, the rain continued to fall, soft as memory. Grace turned her wineglass slowly between her hands. You said something during your panel today, about people brave enough to tell us when we're wrong. That was a beautiful thing to hear. He smiled faintly. It was the truth. You were that person for me. I was also the person you fired, she reminded him, her tone gentle but pointed. I know, he said, and I've carried that every day since. But if I could go back, I'd change it not because I regret what it cost me, but because I finally understand what it cost you. Grace looked down, blinking away the sting in her eyes. You don't need to say that. Yes, I do, he said softly, because it's the truth, and I owe you nothing less than that. He paused, then leaned forward, his tone shifting lower, steadier. Grace, I don't want you back in my company. I just want you back in my life, if you still believe I deserve that. The candle flickered between them, its light catching in her eyes. She stared at him, speechless. It wasn't the confession itself that moved her. It was the humility behind it, the way his voice trembled, not with fear of rejection, but with sincerity. She could feel her heart beating faster, steady against the quiet rhythm of the rain. Ethan, she said finally, her voice a whisper, I don't know if it's about what you deserve. I think it's about what we've learned. He nodded. Then tell me what you've learned. She smiled faintly. That love, the kind that lasts, isn't made of grand gestures. It's made of quiet consistency, of showing up when it's hard, of listening even when it hurts. He held her gaze. And what about trust, she said, is believing that someone can break your heart and still be capable of mending it. Ethan's breath caught. Then do you. She looked out the window at the people passing by under umbrellas, each one carrying their own small story of loss and hope. When she turned back to him, her expression was soft, uncertain, but open. I don't know yet, she said, but I want to. He smiled, not triumphant, not relieved, just grateful. That's enough for me. The waiter returned, refilling their glasses, sensing the intimacy of the moment, but saying nothing. They lingered long after dessert, talking about books, family, the absurdity of corporate life. At one point, Ethan said quietly, I started seeing a therapist. Grace's eyebrows lifted slightly. You... He laughed softly. Shocking. I know, but it's helping. I'm learning that control isn't protection, it's fear pretending to be strength. Grace smiled gently. I'm glad you learned that. He looked at her, voice low. You were my first teacher. She shook her head. No. Ethan, life was... I just happened to be standing there when it started the lesson. When they finally stepped outside, the rain had eased into a mist. The street glowed beneath the lamplight, and the air smelled faintly of lilacs from the flower shop next door. Ethan held the umbrella again, but this time, Grace reached up and took it from him, holding it steady above them both. They walked in silence, close but not touching. At the corner, where their paths would part, Grace stopped. Tonight was good. It was, he said, better than I hoped. She looked up at him, her face half lit by the street lamp. Don't rush whatever this is. Let it grow slowly, like trust. He smiled softly. I can do slow. Good, she said, her voice almost a whisper. Because I'm not ready for fast. He nodded. Then we'll walk. She smiled, then turned, her reflection shimmering briefly in a puddle before she disappeared into the soft rain. Ethan stood there, umbrella in hand, watching her fade into the rhythm of the city. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like promise. Healing, Grace once thought, was like recovery from an illness pain, rest, and then sudden wellness. But real healing, she learned, moved differently. It was slow, uneven. Some days it felt like progress, other days like standing still. And yet, somehow, that was enough. After their dinner in the rain, things between her and Ethan began to take shape again, gently, cautiously, like a song returning after a long silence. They didn't rush it. There were no promises, no declarations, no talk of the future. Instead, there were small moments. A walk through Central Park on Sunday mornings, a cup of coffee shared on a park bench as the city stirred awake, conversations about life, not business, about why things matter, not just how to fix them. Ethan didn't try to impress her. He didn't show up with grand gestures or rehearsed lines. He just showed up consistently, humbly, and without expectation. Grace noticed it, the steadiness, the patience. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it wasn't to persuade, but to share. One morning, as they walked past the fountain near Bethesda Terrace, she said quietly, "You've changed, Ethan. Not just your habits, your presence." He smiled slightly. "Maybe I just stopped trying to earn what I should have been grateful for all along." Grace looked at him, thoughtful. "Gratitude looks good on you." He laughed softly. "So, I've been told." They began to fall into a rhythm, one that didn't demand definition. Sometimes they met for lunch near her Brooklyn office. Sometimes they went to small art galleries on the weekends. Once, they drove north to the Hudson Valley to visit a charity project Ethan's company had started, a mentorship center for young entrepreneurs. Grace watched him speak to the students, not as a CEO, but as a mentor. He wasn't performing. He wasn't commanding. He was listening, kneeling beside a young woman, struggling with her business plan, asking questions, offering gentle advice. Afterward, in the car, Grace said, "You're good with them." Ethan glanced at her, smiling faintly. "They remind me of who I was before I forgot why I started." She nodded, her heart full and quiet. There were still difficult days, of course, moments when old pain rose like a tide. Once, during a coffee meeting, an old colleague stopped by their table, smiling at Ethan. Cole didn't expect to see her again. Guess forgiveness pays well. Huh, Grace froze. The air around them thickened, but before she could speak, Ethan did. He looked at the man calmly and said, "Forgiveness doesn't pay, it heals. And I'm lucky she allowed me anywhere near that process." The man blinked, muttered something awkward, and walked away. Grace said nothing, but her chest ached with a mix of pride and tenderness. For once, she didn't feel like a footnote in someone else's story. As weeks passed, trust began to bloom, not as a grand revelation, but as quiet certainty. Ethan learned how to love without possession. He didn't ask for commitment, didn't demand reassurance. He simply made space for Grace's boundaries, her independence, her silences. One evening, as they sat on a park bench watching the sun set over the Hudson, Grace said, "You used to want everything perfect." He smiled faintly. "Now, I just want everything true." She studied him, her expression soft. "That's harder than perfect." "I know," he said, "but it lasts longer." They sat in silence, the orange light flickering across the water. For Grace, forgiveness didn't come as a single moment, it came in pieces. It came when she realized she could laugh with him again, when she found herself defending his change to a friend who still judged him by his past, when she caught herself trusting his silence instead of fearing it. She wrote in her journal one night, Maybe forgiveness isn't saying it's okay. Maybe it's saying it happened and I'm okay. And for the first time, she meant it. Ethan had his own journey too. He still met with his therapist every Tuesday morning. He still caught himself reverting to old patterns, overworking, overthinking, but now he noticed, now he paused. Sometimes, he would sit alone in his apartment, thinking about how easily he used to fill silence with noise, people, success. Now, he filled it with meaning. He had learned that loving someone meant giving them the freedom to walk away and trusting that if they stayed, it was by choice, not out of obligation. One night, as he walked Grace home after dinner, he stopped at her building steps. "I don't know what this is," he said softly, "but whatever it becomes, I want it to be gentle." Grace smiled, her eyes warm. "Gentle's a good start." Then, after a pause, she added, "You're doing better, Ethan." He looked at her for a long moment. "Because you showed me how." She shook her head. "No. You learned how." They stood there in the soft light of the street lamps, both smiling, both quiet, both understanding. As the months passed, the wounds that once defined them became scars faint, but real. They no longer hurt to touch. They simply reminded them of what had been overcome. Their relationship wasn't perfect, and it wasn't grand, but it was honest. And that, for both of them, was enough. One autumn evening, Grace and Ethan sat side by side at a small outdoor cafe. Leaves fell around them, drifting lazily in the golden light. Grace lifted her cup and said with a small smile, "To progress." Ethan raised his glass of tea. "To patience." They clinked lightly, laughter soft and genuine. And as the city buzzed quietly around them, they both understood something simple and profound, that healing isn't about forgetting the past. It's about learning to walk through it, hand in hand, and still move forward. A full year had passed since that rainy night in Greenwich Village. The city had changed its colors again, spring's pale blossoms giving way to summer's brightness, then fading into the deep golds of another autumn. And with time, both Ethan Cole and Grace Miller had changed too. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but quietly, in the way that true growth always happens from the inside out. One bright October morning, the doors of the Miller Cole Foundation officially opened. It wasn't a grand event, no red carpets, no cameras, just a gathering of colleagues, community partners, and a few young entrepreneurs whose faces shone with hope. The foundation's mission was simple, yet revolutionary, to support small businesses in maintaining ethical practices while growing sustainably. To give them what both Ethan and Grace had once lost, guidance grounded in integrity. The main office was modest, a sunlit floor in a renovated building overlooking the Hudson River. The name gleamed softly on the entrance plaque, the Miller Cole Foundation Integrity. Purpose, compassion. Grace had insisted that her name come first. Ethan hadn't argued. He only smiled and said, "It should. You led the way." She had smiled back, eyes kind. We both learned how to follow what's right. Inside the office, the mood was light. Staff mingled, laughter filling the air. A local newspaper reporter had asked for a short interview, and Ethan, usually reluctant about such things, had agreed. The reporter smiled. "Mr. Cole, Ms. Miller, people are calling this the comeback story of the decade. How does it feel?" Grace chuckled. "If it's a comeback, it's a quiet one," Ethan added. "We're not chasing redemption, we're investing in prevention. If one business avoids the mistakes we made, that's success." "Would you call this your proudest achievement?" the reporter asked. Ethan glanced at Grace before answering. "No," he said softly. "Pride built my first empire. Humility built this one. I'd call that peace." The reporter smiled, thanked them, and moved on. But the words lingered. Grace looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Peace suits you, Ethan." He smiled. "It took me long enough to earn it." As the crowd slowly thinned, Ethan stepped outside to the balcony overlooking the river. The air was crisp, the sun lowering toward the horizon, painting the water in liquid gold. Grace joined him, holding 2 cups of coffee his black, hers sweetened with cream, the same as always. They stood side by side, watching the reflection of the sky ripple against the current. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It is." He agreed. "You know, I used to look at this view and think about expansion, about the next deal, the next summit, the next measure of success. And now?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Now, I just think about balance, about keeping what matters steady." Grace nodded, sipping her coffee. "That's harder than it looks." He glanced at her. "You've made it look easy." She laughed quietly. "Don't be fooled. It's a daily choice. Every decision, every conversation you choose who you want to be." Ethan looked out at the horizon. "I used to think success was power," he said softly. "Now I know success is love, earned through humility." Grace turned to him, her expression warm, eyes glistening in the fading light. "That," she said, "might be the best definition I've ever heard." As twilight deepened, they walked along the river path behind the building, the city lights beginning to shimmer across the Hudson. Couples strolled hand in hand. Children's laughter floated on the breeze. The world moved with its quiet rhythm, as if reminding them that peace wasn't something to chase, it was something to return to. Ethan glanced at Grace. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" She smiled. "All the time. And sometimes, I think about how far we had to fall to learn what rising really means." He nodded slowly. "I think that fall saved me." Grace looked at him, thoughtful. "No. Ethan, you saved you. I just refused to let you stay the man who didn't believe you could." He stopped walking for a moment, taking in her words. Then he said quietly, "You were the light that showed me where I was standing." She smiled, a soft kind of smile, the kind that carried years of understanding. "And you were the lesson that taught me love doesn't mean losing yourself." They stood there, neither speaking, both knowing that some truths didn't need to be said twice. Later that evening, after the guests had gone and the lights inside the foundation dimmed, they returned once more to the balcony. The Hudson shimmered under the last glow of sunset, streaks of orange and pink blending into silver blue. The city murmured in the distance, a living heartbeat of all they had once been and all they had yet to become. Ethan leaned against the railing, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "Do you ever wonder if we were meant to end up here?" Grace tilted her head, her hair catching the light breeze. "Maybe not meant, maybe guided. Sometimes the universe has to break what we build, so we remember what we were building for." He looked at her then, really looked not as a CEO, not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as someone who had finally found peace in partnership, not possession. He reached out his hand. She took it, gently, no words, no promises, just connection, calm, steady, real. The last light slipped behind the skyline. The water glowed like molten glass. Grace leaned slightly against him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You did it. Ethan." He shook his head softly. "We did." A quiet moment passed. Then, with the ease of two souls finally home, they both turned toward the horizon, toward the line where sky met water, where endings and beginnings blurred into one. And as the evening settled around them, the sound of the river filled the air steady, patient, eternal. It was the sound of peace, of forgiveness, of love that had earned its way back into truth. That night, the sign outside their building glowed faintly in the dark. The Miller Coal Foundation. It wasn't a monument to success. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful empires are the ones built from humility, second chances, and grace. In the rush of life, many of us chase success, the titles, the numbers, the recognition, but sometimes it takes losing everything to understand what truly matters. Ethan's story reminds us that real strength isn't control, it's compassion. that the greatest leaders and the greatest hearts are the ones humble enough to listen, brave enough to admit their mistakes, and wise enough to change. Grace's journey teaches that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the pain. It means choosing peace over bitterness, and finding the courage to love again not because the past disappears, but because we've grown strong enough to rise above it. In the end, success is not measured by wealth or status, but by the love we give, the lives we touch, and the humility we carry forward. So slow down, look around, and remember, sometimes the richest life begins the moment we choose kindness over pride. Thank you, dear friends, for staying with us until the very end of this story. If Ethan and Grace's journey touched your heart, if it reminded you of the power of forgiveness, of second chances, or simply of the quiet beauty of change, we'd be so grateful if you'd share that feeling forward. Please like this video, share it with someone who believes in love and redemption, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next heartfelt story we bring to life. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that heal, inspire, and remind us all that it's never too late to start again. From all of us here at Shining Stories, thank you for listening, for feeling, and for believing.